Yes, Ben, take me to Travis Etienne. Where are you with him?
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you that I think it was very exciting. We've been talking sort of since the beginning of the offseason that James Robinson is going to be certainly further behind on a rehab schedule than Etienne. Etienne obviously breaks his foot in the offseason and misses the year. Robinson tears his Achilles late in the season. Now there's some optimism with some of the other recent Achilles recoveries, but even with guys like Marlon Mack, who got really glowing reports last year, we didn't really see a whole lot. The other guy that I think brought some optimism was Donta Foreman, playing pretty well last year, but that was several years removed from the Achilles. I think we have to expect that James Robinson's probably not going to be a pretty effective player in 2023, especially when we talk about how late his Achilles tear came in the season. And so you have Etienne, and all Jacksonville adds at running back is Snoop Conner in the 5th round. We were kind of joking on the stream that I think you were kind of describing him as sort of a fringe, not really prospect. And that is something that I love about talking with you, and I love about your process is, you're not just saying generic 5th round running back. You're saying 5th round running back that I also don't believe has the talent to really command opportunity right away. The rest of that depth chart is very thin. I mean, Raquel Armstead had a really tough bout with COVID that cost him, I think, most of last year. He's like the most notable name on the rest of the depth chart. It's looking now like Travis Etienne might be in this position to get a lot of work in year 2. And there was already a lot of reasons to be very excited about him in that sort of DeAndre Swift mold. I've talked to some people that are really concerned about this Jacksonville offense, but now you have Doug Peterson taking over. It was terrible last year, but we've gotten a lot of reports that a lot of that had to do with Urban Meyer and the way things were going. I'm not saying they're going to turn it all around immediately, but you don't have a very good wide receiver core, very much like DeAndre Swift. You have a bad team that is probably going to be trailing and throwing. We don't always know how teams are going to approach that, whether they're going to throw enough. The Lions were fun in that regard last year, but there's nobody on this offense that's going to really command a ton of volume or looks likely to command a ton of volume. And so Trevor Lawrence, checking down to the guy that he played college football with and is familiar with where he's going to be at on the field as he releases out of the backfield on some of these, pass block and release routes and things, he's going to know where Etienne's at. People might kind of scoff at this. I'm basically taking this idea of QB wide receiver familiarity and applying it to QB running back, but I think it does probably matter. I mean, Etienne had that receiving profile. And one of the things we talked about earlier in the offseason is if he plays basically at all last year, he's probably going higher in drafts than he is now. Basically, the only way to be getting him in this sort of 5th and sometimes 6th round range like you can get him in right now is that if he didn't play all of last year, which he didn't. But remember, this guy was a guy that as a prospect, a lot of people, including myself, and I'm pretty sure including you, Shawn, had higher than Najee Harris. He went 1 pick behind Najee Harris. He's a 1st round pick from last year's draft. He's going to play. And people are sort of already putting him on like this Rashad Penny track where he's injury prone and he's not going to be productive over a long period of time. It's not at all hard to see him come out and have a DeAndre Swift type season this year, right?
I don't think so. And you mentioned we had him higher. He had a better score in the running back prospect lab, especially at the running back position. The prospect lab does a very good job of letting you get a sense of sort of tiers for prospects and what you're really looking at in terms of floor and ceiling outcomes for NFL guys. And Etienne scores better than Harris and Javonte Williams in that. Not a huge gap, but he's definitely a guy that we wanted to be on. Then both of these injuries are actually pretty scary. That foot injury we know is not an easy rehab, and there are some chances that it doesn't work out properly. That Achilles, you mentioned guys can come back, but one of the things that really stood out to me was an article on the site about Marlon Mack by Dr. Jeffrey Budoff, who's done some great medical work for us, talking about how these guys come back and they're theoretically at 100% in terms of, maybe not having lingering pain or being able to go out there and do what they're supposed to do. But there's actually a much longer period before the explosiveness comes back. And so you're taking a back and you're taking a name in your head who's been at a certain level before, and then there's going to be a while. So Mack in some ways is interesting now with the Houston Texans because he's had this time and maybe he can get back to being who he was. Obviously, we saw him last year in a situation where he was back, but not explosive. You look at Robinson, and that's kind of the case with him. And it really hurts for him, I think, because he's somebody I think is vastly underrated, even among fantasy managers who are enthusiastic about what he's done, vastly underrated as an actual talent. That guy is one of the best running backs in the NFL. And so that does hurt Etienne if both of those guys are there. But one of the things that this pick, I think, tells us a little bit, and this could be, looking too far into it, could just be something that Snoop Connor was their favorite guy on the board when they picked. But you're talking about a big guy, right? So, 222. And that, I think, you would argue, well, there's probably more overlap with what Robinson does than what Etienne does. Maybe that's a little bit of a window into how the rehab is going. As you said, we would expect Etienne to be ahead. And then Connor himself, and this isn't one of these things where we want to take pot shots at guys or that type of thing. We always mention how we're kind of rooting for these players. We hope that we're wrong, but it is something that as you're doing your own fantasy drafts, it does matter how good players are, and not all late round prospects are the same. I just had an article out on the site yesterday about the guy I think who is this year's Elijah Mitchell. Now, obviously, there's not going to be an Elijah Mitchell this year, but there are some really good players late, like Mitchell was, who have these profiles where you're like, okay, if they get the right chance, then there's at least a possibility, because players who are athletic and productive, even when they're drafted late, they sometimes pan out. That's probably not the case here with Connor, right? I mean, you're talking about a guy with a 4.59 40 and a career high at Ole Miss of 651 rushing yards. His last 2 years, he's under 5 yards per carry. He's not a receiving back. So again, I mean, this is sort of a throwaway pick to an extent. And anytime that a team could potentially have added somebody because they have these injuries at running back, and that's exactly the same things with Dobbins and Gus Edwards. I like the Beatty pick because he maybe has the closest profile to Dobbins. I think Dobbins is the guy that's going to score a ton of points. I don't think that's going to be as much of a committee as people think. For a long time, I thought that Edwards was a real, almost a long shot to actually be on the Ravens this next year. As we've gone along the last couple of weeks, I think that his situation has solidified, but you have Beatty there as somebody who could fill in that Dobbins role. And he's not J.K. Dobbins, but he's a pretty cool prospect. In both of these situations, there was the possibility that they would add guys. They didn't do it. A couple other situations where they didn't do it, the New York Giants, the New Orleans Saints.
Yeah, two former, top 3 overall pick backs, Saquon Barkley, Alvin Kamara, look like they're in good spots. Mark Ingram is still there with the Saints, and he certainly changed things for Kamara a little bit late last year. And for the Giants, Devonta Booker is no longer, but they did bring in Matt Breida from Buffalo. Obviously, the new brain trust was in Buffalo last year, and Breida was interesting kind of late last year. But it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of competition for either of those guys. Kamara, we do have some concerns and uncertainty off the field. I think you had mentioned to me that it's starting to sound like any potential suspension there might come in 2023. Barkley is the one that you've been pretty excited about all offseason. I think you've gotten me excited. I saw an interview with him just in the weeks before the draft, and I think this made pretty big waves. So maybe a lot of our listeners saw it as well. But he, pretty much acknowledged, I haven't given this organization what they thought they were getting because of health, right? But when they took him in the second round, and he doesn't like that. He wants to make sure that he's going down as, worthy of being considered a generational running back prospect and these types of things. You can say whatever you want about that. I it's just a player commenting. They're all going to be optimistic, but it was a little bit of a competitiveness that I really liked, because one of the things that, is really hard in any kind of fantasy analysis is knowing just where these guys' heads are at, where their conditioning is at in the offseason and things like that. Obviously, every year we hear the best shape of your life type stuff, all of those things. But one of the things that I've given a lot of consideration to is sometimes we probably don't wind up getting the same player as maybe they were at a time in college or whatever, because maybe their conditioning hasn't been as good going into the pros. Maybe they've lost a little bit of their athleticism because they're not taking care of their body as well as maybe they should have, or some of those types of things. It seems like that's not a concern with Barkley. It seems like Barkley is very committed. And I don't want to, go too deep into that. It's pure speculation, obviously. But I do like the idea that Barkley is willing to say straight up, I know I have more to give than what I've given, and has this, chip on his shoulder, so to speak. I'm not going to lie, it makes me want to draft him more.
Yeah, that is cool. And in many cases, too, it's not necessarily a matter of anything the player can do. Just running backs get old very fast, as we saw with Todd Gurley and David Johnson and Le'Veon Bell.
And Ezekiel Elliott, who was a best shape of his life guy last year, and it didn't really pan out.
Right. It's like, you can be in fantastic shape. I could get in the best shape of my life, it would take months at this point. But once I did that, I would still not be the same athlete that I was maybe in the not quite best shape of my life, in my early 20s. So we'll see how that works out. But I do love the situation here now. And I'm looking at my redraft rankings. Tier 3 for me is Dalvin Cook, Breece Hall, Alvin Kamara, Saquon Barkley, and J.K. Dobbins. And then tier 4, which I think have some of the names that people are actually going to be expecting: Joe Mixon, James Conner, Nick Chubb, Javonte Williams, Travis Etienne, and Aaron Jones. Am I too high on him there? The names that I could potentially be much too high on would be obviously Hall and Barkley, and then Dobbins we've just discussed. But Mixon, Chubb, Javonte, even with Melvin Gordon, you explained why it's not the same issue that it was last year. We'll see what an issue it is in terms of ceiling. We always talk about Najee Harris, and it's just he doesn't have to be that good because he's got all of the work. Any names that jump out to you there as being in the wrong place, and or especially as we're looking at these guys that we mentioned as winners, are they looking to be in the right place? Are you excited about those guys at that point?
I think a lot of the veterans I'm not super excited about. I think I want Javonte at that price. I think I want that's definitely an aggressive Breece Hall ranking, but I want exposure to him, certainly. Saquon is one of the veterans that stands out there as a guy that I would be very interested in. Yeah, the biggest name that stuck out to me was Javonte. I was like, oh, you would have him even behind like Mixon and Chubb, or in that tier. I think I'd have him the tier up.
And I think there's good justification for that because the upside to really break out is there. Mixon, Ben, I don't think that he's necessarily talked about as a winner because maybe I was the only person expecting them to possibly add, but he has the same mildly underwhelming depth chart behind him. He's still not really draftable for me because he has this profile where the price and what he could do. I don't think that he's going to be one of these guys who at this stage of his career breaks out and becomes something completely different. Although with that workload and in the Bengals offense, and he could be sort of a historical anomaly and jump into that legendary range this season purely as a result of context. And I think that for me, the fact that the Bengals haven't addressed the depth chart with him, haven't given him sort of a 1B, does at least free him up for that chance.
Well, that caught me off guard a little bit. I had to gather myself for a moment. You just made the case that Mixon has legendary upside. The way I'm looking at it is, yes, the offense is fantastic, but even last year when it was fantastic, he was very good and had a career high in touchdowns, if I'm not mistaken. Had a few games, especially when they went pretty run heavy, where he was sort of like the focal point of the offense. I expect that to be a little bit less frequent. My thing is, like, you're just getting another year older on a guy that hasn't shown the type of efficiency. We talk a lot about how the expected points need to be at a certain level, but you also have to have the efficiency on top of it. He's, with the touchdowns last year, that's how you can do it. And he had 16 TDs last year, and it was a career. I had never had a double-digit touchdown season. I don't know that he can match those 16 TDs necessarily. I think we can talk about how good this offense is, but my bet would be on the under on that number, right? And then you have this, he had 292 rushes last year, 300 rush seasons are tough in the modern NFL. I don't expect we will see him getting particularly close to that, whether by potential injury, obviously, or just the offense being more pass heavy and not giving him those, close to 30 carry games that he had a few of. I don't really see it. I'm not that interested. I kind of saw it a little bit last year more, frankly, but now that we've seen, in the sense that the touchdown spike was, I think, a little bit foreseeable, but now that we've seen those touchdowns and people are, looking at this career high in yards and career high in touchdowns and one off his career high in receptions last year. Now you're talking about, okay, he's a 26-year-old back who's coming off all these career highs. I don't want to pay for pass production, even though his price is basically the same as it was last year. It's not like that elevated his price a ton. But I don't know. I've been looking at it like this is the type of guy that I wind up being off of. Maybe I'm just not adjusting enough to the fact that his price, frankly, hasn't adjusted a lot.
Well, he was 10th in running back expected points last year, and he's in that 16 range where it's just not high enough to burn, a first or second round pick unless you could put up like a 6 FPOE season. He actually did very nicely last year. You mentioned all those touchdowns. That gets him to 1.9. But, you're still in a range there where you were undraftable at that price. And so we would need to believe he's actually going to benefit more from an offense that should be more pass heavy. There are ways that could happen, but as you mentioned, that's a narrow path to victory. But any of these other guys, we want to get to the losers here. In some ways, the losers are more fun. Any of these other winner names stick out to you? We have Darnell Mooney, the Chargers wide receivers. I thought there was a possibility that they would add somebody, Gabriel Davis. Now we like Khalil Shakir, but they didn't add a wide receiver in the first round. I didn't think they were going to, but there were a lot of sharp minds who thought that was a real possibility. They didn't add a wide receiver at that spot where they went with Cook. And so, he seems very insulated now in an explosive role. Jalen Hurts, very clear-cut winner. It's more a case of like, just how high can you draft him? And can you put him up in that Lamar Jackson, Kyler Murray category now that he has those receiving weapons? And
his best friend. His
best friend.
Yeah.
Such a good story. I know Ben has spent the last couple of days photoshopping him onto like every place in the country, perhaps on the moon. We love that. And then, this was expected. The Jets telegraphed all this, but Zach Wilson is a winner. He's going to be surrounded by weapons. You can either make it or you can't at this point. He's got guys to throw to.
Yep. I think you kind of gave the Cliff notes on all of those guys well. The ones like Darnell Mooney don't really need a lot of explanation. So I think we should shift over to the losers. I will just say before completely turning the page on Mixon, you have him as a winner, but I do want to – I think for me, I'm still concerned about Samaje Perine and Chris Evans, the guys that were backing him up last year, who were both pretty effective behind him. And again, when I talk about the size of the workload – Chris Evans can still catch some of those passes if they go more pass heavy. He looked pretty decent as a pass catcher, and Perine's been good as a backup. So still has some competition on the current roster, even though they didn't add another competitive piece. It could be looked at that way, right? That the Bengals already liked what they had. But the losers, you have a bunch of running backs. You have Cam Akers and Darrell Henderson. That's kind of an interesting one because all the Rams added was Kyron Williams, but he does profile as a very specific type of player that they haven't necessarily used, a pass catcher. And so that is, a real concern for passing down. So you have Damian Harrison or Ramondre Stevenson. Obviously, the Patriots added a couple of backs and one that you love in Pierre Strong. You have Leonard Fournette. The Bucs in the third round go for Rachaad White. He's one of our favorite rookie draft picks with a lot of upside with the size, speed, and pass catching combo. He's going to be one of my favorite handcuffs in redraft this year. If Fournette were to miss time, that I think he would be more talented and expected to be more talented than what we've seen out of Keyshawn Vaughn. I think we've got enough sort of negative feedback on Keyshawn Vaughn to believe that Rachaad White would be the bet to sort of lead that backfield. There's no guarantees, obviously, but it's a bet I'd want to make in that situation. Michael Carter obviously gets joined by the top running back in the class, Antonio Gibson. Washington goes and adds James Robinson, and they're talking about a 1-2 punch. Austin Eckler, the Chargers at Isaiah Spiller, who you were mentioning to me prior to the show. You've watched some more film on the other day in the last couple of days since the draft, and thought he looked really good. I mean, obviously didn't have the speed, the 40 time that we were hoping for, but he seems to fit really well into that big back role, something they wanted to do last year and maybe just didn't think Joshua Kelly, Larry Roundtree, some of those guys they had were up to the task, which is part of why Austin Eckler was able to consolidate so much work, especially down around the goal line. Spiller, a real concern for that. Elijah Mitchell, they add another third-round running back in Tyrion Davis-Price, who's a 4.48 guy at size, at 230. Rashad Penny, they obviously had Kenneth Walker. James Robinson, you have as a loser with a question mark here. We kind of already addressed him. So your first 8 on this list or 9 on this list are all running backs. I think you can make a really strong case for basically all of them being losers. Who are the ones of that group that stand out the most to you?
Well, this Patriots thing, it still is mind-boggling for me. And, we joked on the stream that if there's a position that you actually are very good at evaluating, just pick that position entirely. If it's running back, then, there are only so many running backs you can play in any given play, and there are only so many snaps in any given game. You've got to take your other good running backs off to you. This is devastating for Ramondre Stevenson, isn't it? I was joking with Pat the other day on overtime. Is there a chance that Pierre Strong doesn't make the team so that we can move him somewhere where he could be useful? I love Stevenson. I love Strong. I moved Damian Harris, more or less out of my redraft rankings and then had to go back in and put him in a spot where, but at least admits that he's the starter still. But you're talking about zero ceiling now for him. He already had a workload that didn't work that great for fantasy. You get the touchdowns, but now he's got all of these other backs who are so similar. And we know that, maybe there's this exploitable opportunity for Harris and Stevenson as Strong and Harris essentially get redshirted. We know that they do that, but there's just too many guys. And we're right back to the situation where, you could never play these guys in a normal format. It would have to be best ball. And even then, you're using a pick that could go to a player who actually breaks out and does the Rashad Penny or the James Conner or the Devin Singletary type of thing, where they give you this stretch of games down the stretch of your tournament and you win your tournament as a result. I don't know. Am I looking at this incorrectly? I love Stevenson. A couple of my favorite people, Travis May, got me on him last year. Obviously, Pat was on him too. He looked like a potential star. Pierre Strong is one of the best backs in this draft. I've suggested he could be the third best back. It doesn't matter now, right? These guys are all completely stuck.
And you still have James White, who was a free agent this offseason, and the Patriots brought back on a 2-year contract. I think they can get out of that. It sounds like
he may not be healthy, but either way, yeah, you have him there as well.
Yeah, I think they wouldn't. The way I'm looking at it is they wouldn't have brought him back if they didn't, see value there, right? There's not a lot of guarantees there. There's only $500,000 in fully guaranteed money, and there is actually a small roster bonus due in the beginning of August. It's possible he gets cut if he's not healthy by the beginning of August, but there is, a base value of $5 million over 2 years. It's a decent contract if he's actually on the roster. It seems like the Patriots certainly are considering moving forward with him continuing to be their passing downs back into his age 30 season this year. He's an easy one to forget. And it's really complicated now. If White is there, especially, I think, and you don't even have the passing work, or at least a good chunk of the passing work, and the third down work is going to James White, now you're talking about a 2-down competition among multiple talented backs that, White may not stay healthy and all those things. And if that can free up, like you said, it could also consolidate at a certain point, and there could be this stretch where one of these running backs is sort of the lead guy and also playing some on passing downs and has a really nice stretch. But it's really hard to see how this season will play out in terms of their backfield snaps and playing time. It can go a lot of different ways. I'm with you. I think you put that really eloquently, that these guys are more or less not going to be worth They're drafting, and they're going to go higher than where you probably want to take them when you mix in Pierre Strong. Are there other running backs you want to talk about? I want to talk about some of the receivers that you have listed here as losers.
Yeah, well, just kind of quick notes, as you mentioned, Kyron Williams, not a high draft pick, but has this James White profile that, you just talked about how White could really hurt the Patriots. Cam Akers and Darrell Henderson already in this situation where they can't afford to have the pie split anymore. Now, maybe they're still, and maybe it's actually the slightly most likely scenario that Akers gets healthy, consolidates, and those other guys are pure backups, and they have them there. In case Akers gets hurt, you can do this cool Henderson-Williams committee, and that's effective. And so some of this is just contingencies, especially at that draft price, but it does raise this sort of ugly specter to where, your EP profiles for those guys are pretty devastating. I actually did a trade, a month before the draft or so, where I swapped A.J. Dillon for Michael Carter. That didn't work out. I think it made some sense. I'm not upset about that trade because if the Jets don't hit Carter with Hall, then I think you pretty clearly win. You're thinking they could easily do that. If they do it, then you lose, but you don't lose by this massive amount because both guys are backups. Carter is just one injury away, and we don't want anybody to get hurt, but he's just one injury away from being very valuable again. But obviously he's lost a ton of value. You got some of those other guys. Elijah Mitchell's interesting. Mitchell might be a player who now falls to a level where you can draft him. I guess I would be a little bit skeptical about some of his backups if he can stay healthy, and if Debo is successful in sort of getting himself back to the receiving role. Mitchell could be a little bit of this almost post-hype potential.
Well, before we move on, Mitchell's really interesting to me because he's a guy I've been pretty much fading and trying to trade in Dynasty and been off of. Tyrion Davis-Price to me feels very much like an attempt at a redo on Trey Sermon because he's got the size profile. And we know that the Niners have sort of had multiple roles for their kind of inside the tackles grinders and their, speed edge guys. And Davis-Price has enough of a profile that he could potentially be a speed guy, but he's more of a size speed guy, right? I think his time was 4.48, and it's impressive at his size, but it's not really what they're looking for with this true lightning type back that they had with Raheem Mostert, and then they kind of used Elijah Mitchell as. I like your thoughts there. I think if his price starts to get more palatable, that he then maybe becomes an interesting buy as the next Raheem Mostert, even if he's not able to get as much work as he did last year. He would still seem to have a role and not have a ton of competition in that role.
And I think he could add some receptions. That's exactly right on Davis-Price, because we tend to think of these guys as, what's the speed score, and forget that it's not just size adjusted athleticism. I mean, the pure speed actually matters. What Mostert did, and Mostert, a guy posting, some of the best actual on-field times of any running back in the NFL over the last 3 or 4 years. You're not going to do that with someone who's essentially a 4.5 speed guy. Now, it doesn't mean they couldn't be a big part of the offense, but that, quick strike ability is still going to be much more Mitchell. He's also someone who could add some receptions. They bring him in as a late drafted rookie. He wins the starting job, but it's a lot to handle right away. And so we saw JaMychal Hasty do some of those touches, but Mitchell is not someone who has no receiving background, right? As a sophomore at Louisiana, he caught 20 passes for 349 yards. Now, again, when he's going against non-NFL secondaries in that situation, but when you're talking about the pure breakout speed, when you turn 20 receptions into 349 receiving yards, it's again just something that,
17 and a half yards a catch. Is that right?
It's gigantic. And so Mitchell's somebody fun. Don't overpay, but I think a player to now sprinkle into your zero RB approach, because he's now going to definitely fall into that area, at least in some formats and some drafts.
Yeah, he's definitely a little more interesting. Yeah, it's funny. We're talking about him here as a loser. I think we're talking ourselves into him being a winner, potentially as it relates to market perception. I think he's definitely a loser, but people might think he's too much of a loser. Tyrion Davis-Price. I also saw today that Deebo Samuel has followed the 49ers back on social media, which is the big reporting of 2022, is when players are following or not following their teams, it would seem that Tyrion Davis-Price is a better fit for the Debo rushes, right? Again, the Trey Sermon, this bigger back role that they were treating Debo Samuel as late in last season. Maybe that was a pick that actually made Debo happy because it was sort of presented to him as, look, now you're not going to have to play running back anymore. We got this other big back, and either Davis-Price or Sermon or maybe some sprinkles of Debo will be handling that stuff, but it just doesn't seem to be really affecting what Elijah Mitchell does in the offense.